Hello and welcome to the Alexander Society. I'm Tim, but today is a special, different little episode. We're going to be doing our opposite day episode. So I'm going to be your stellar storyteller, purveyor of history, and Derek is going to be forced to participate, kicking and streaming, much like the many young girls our subject supposedly tortured and murdered to satisfy her bloodlust. How are you today, Derek?
I feel like I'm about to be tortured and murdered. I'm not gonna lie, dude.
Well, okay. I'm not bad myself. So what are you drinking tonight, Derek?
Oh, what am I drinking tonight? Okay, so I'm for the shots. I'm sticking with the bird dog, the stuff that I had last episode, because you know what? I have it. It's good. Don't need to spend any more money right now, to be honest. Um, but for my beer, what I'm drinking, oh my god, this stuff is so good. So me and Tim recently took a little trippy trip to just like a little brewery crawl through.
I don't know if it counts if it was only two breweries.
It's just a little itty bitty baby brewery crawl, let's just say. But one of our stops was at Angry Scotsman Brewing, which I love. All of their stuff I've tried so far, I've really loved. But they had this stuff that I tried there.
And you took two sips, walked over, grabbed a 4 pack, didn't ask the price, and told her to put it on your tab.
Yes, I took. Yeah, I that is exactly what happened. I ended up spending like $30 on a 4 pack of beer because this stuff is like 14%. But
I was so confused at why your bill was so much more than mine. Then she was like, "No, that that beer was 40 bucks, $30." And I was like, "Holy shit!"
yeah, it's ridiculous. But you know what? It it's a good beer, so I'll let it slide this time. It's called Tenebris Abbot, I think is how it's Tenebris, whatever.
We hope you find our ignorance charming, as one of my favorite podcasts would say.
Well, no, this one's it's a Belgian style. It's a really dark ale, but it was brewed in it was quadruple brewed in cherry brandy barrels, or it was aged in cherry brandy barrels. So it's like 14%. It tastes like it has like the hint of cherry behind it. It's not like fake either. It's like actually infused. It's amazing. It's fantastic. It's one of the best beers I have ever had in my life. I love it to death. It's so good. But oh, what are you drinking, Tim?
So tonight I'm going to be drinking Tiny S's for my beer from Prairie Brewing. It was one of the drinks I tried on our tour, and I about had a sugar overload from it because it was that delicious. It literally tastes like liquid Skittles to me.
Yeah, that one was a little too much. It was a little too sweet for me. But a lot of those sours were,
Said the guy who likes dark beers. I would have never guessed.
yeah.
And then for my shots, I'm drinking the Paul Mason Peach whiskey you gave me.
The Parmesan. I think that says brandy, isn't it?
So, because today is the opposite day podcast, um, we've unintentionally done less educated research. That's on my bad. But I read the book Elisabeth Bathory, a memoir as told by her count, Courtmaster Benedict Desto by Kimberly Craft. And I did not realize that this was basically her fan fiction of events of what happened, filling in the gaps from history. But she has done a lot of research into Elizabeth, so I trust a lot of the base research that went in there. So there might be embellishments in here that are not true, and we're going to have to just accept that because we realized too late that I realized it right as you were getting on and telling me, "Hey, I ain't never heard of this guy," and I was like, "Well, he seems to be real." And then I read her forward, which I skip forwards normally, and she said he was a real person, but I've kind of like taken liberties, and I was like, "Oh shit."
Like I did like some quick searching around, and I looked at the author's bio, and
She seems to be a very well versed person in Elizabeth Bathory, from what I found.
Yeah, she definitely seems to be. She is a an expert on the topic of Bathory. I'm sure she's very well informed, and the book has a lot all accurate information. But um,
We're also going to point out where we think on my telling of events is most likely her embellishments, and where you should probably not take it super seriously. Although a lot of the stuff on in Elizabeth's life isn't super well known due to the propaganda of the time, because it just everything that survived was she was an evil, horrible blood countess.
yeah. So and honestly, like the only stuff I found in like your script that I couldn't verify with like the information that I had found was mostly just it was just like stuff like the particulars of like certain crimes and like certain accounts, which I honestly,
And from what I've seen, there's not a lot of information on particular crimes for the most part.
yeah, I think a big part of that is just because like there were like 300 different there or certain
She's I've seen wildly vastly different numbers. I've seen 300, 350, and this one I really don't believe was in the 600s.
and I'll get into it a little bit at the end after you've done your part. But a big part of that's not a historic like a lost to history sort of misinformation kind of thing. That was happening during the trial too. Was there were, like wildly different body counts from different witnesses?
Yeah, there's one book I fully read as like actual extra little information, and two others I started but didn't have time to finish because I didn't give myself enough time. That's on me. I start uh, the two I didn't finish were both from Kimberly Craft. It was her more historically accurate versions of the event is Infamous Lady, the True Story of Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Elisabeth Bathory is the actual title, second edition. And then the other one that I didn't finish was The Private Letters of Countess Elisabeth Bathory by Kimberly Craft. That one is literally just her translating letters and kind of giving a little bit of context of the time. And then the other book that I did finish, uh, I listened to it. I didn't read it, but I count them as the same personally. I don't know about most people. Is by James Oliver, and it's Life and Legacy of History's Most Prolific Female Serial Killer. Um, and he kind of leans into a lot of just the stereotypical narrative, um, but does admit, hey, there's some doubt here. We don't know everything.
Right. Yeah.
There was a lot of motive to frame her.
You want to cover the rules real quick?
Yes. So this week our rules are. This is the first time I've made the rules, so bear with us if they're not great. Our first rule is every time Derek has to correct me, we will take a sip.
Rule number two is every time a servant of the late Miss Bathory is tortured, we take 3 sips.
And then every time there's a story that probably didn't happen, and this feels more apt with knowing that I basically got a fan fiction instead, we'll take a shot. But I was more meaning the some other stuff that we'll get to. I'll explain it later, but hey ho. Before we get into the bulk of our story today, we're going to go ahead and take a shot, as we do every episode, to start off our show. Kampai.
Prost.
Our story starts in 1560 with the birth of Elizabeth in Nirbator, Royal Hungary. She was born to Baron George VI Bathory of the Essid branch and Anna Bathory of the Somielo branch. There were two branches of the family, so her parents were like cousins. I can't remember how close of a cousin.
Yeah, they were probably like distant cousins because the two.
It wasn't super related, but probably related enough that something we'll come across later was probably caused by it.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's definitely likely that there was a fair bit more intermarrying like a little bit closer than just her parents, or a little bit further than just her parents within that family line.
Elisabeth Bathory, or better known as her anglicized name, Elisabeth Bathory, was known as the Blood Countess. Her story is pretty well known if you're plugged into the true crime world. She's also considered to be one of the inspirations for Dracula. I don't know how true that is. I also know Vlad the Impaler was considered an inspiration too. Do you know anything about that, Derek?
It's I can see why, because like they're both families that are heavily associated with the region of Transylvania. Um, there were a lot of Bathories that were princes and voivodes of voivod was like a royal appointed minister over the region, but a lot of like very high ranking people who led uh, Transylvania, both from the Bathories and from the Tepish family, which is Vlad the Impaler's family. They um, so is I Bram Stoker, yeah. I know Bram Stoker. He got a lot of his inspiration for Dracula from ostensibly from like Romanian and especially Transylvanian legends, or so he claimed. Um, and so like two of the most famous names to come out of or to be associated with Transylvania was one guy who impaled people, famous for impaling people, and a woman famous for torturing young women. So it makes sense. It makes sense where that connection would come from.
Yeah. So the Bathory House was founded in 1310 after Hungarian King Laz Lewis. Also, I hope you guys forgive my
Yeah,
pronunciations. I don't think I could ever, no matter how much I train, pronounce stuff right. It's just gonna happen with me.
that one. Yeah, that one is King Ladislaus
Ladislav, is that the fourth or sixth?
the fourth.
Fourth. Okay. I am super dyslexic on Roman numerals, guys. Um, he awarded the Bathory estate to one of his commanders, Brictus, who took the name of the estate Bathory. The House of Bathory, we mentioned them, split into two branches: the senior branch, the Somlio, and the junior branch, the Essid. Do you have any extra little things you want to add on the family or the political climate that you know as our history historian in chief?
Well, yeah, as far as the political climate, this is like the late fifth, the late 16th century. So Hungary at the time was ruled by the Habsburgs. So it whoever was um, the arch the archduke or arch yeah the archduke of Austria, who was the head of the House of Habsburg, and usually like the Holy Roman Emperor would also be the king, or later on with Maria Theresa, as we talked about in Frederick the Great's episodes, the Queen of Hungary. So those were always two titles that were shared by the same person, at least around this time. That was a fairly recent development at that point. But
Okay.
the Bathories, that house, were relatively, I wouldn't say they were new. They're a few hundred years old at this point, but they had only become, like you mentioned, had only even formed existed as a house since 1310. And but by that point they were some of the most powerful and largest landowners in Hungary at the time. And that was this was during another really interesting time. This is just like a generation removed from the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah. So I actually found out her family raised her Protestant Calvinists specifically, and I was hoping you could provide a little bit more on Calvinism. I think it's one may have been one of the religions you've mentioned, but I can't remember for the life of me.
Yeah, yeah. Calvinism is it was part of like kind of the second wave of the revolution or the Reformation. So the first wave was like the Lutheranist sort of part of it, and then the second wave after that, guys like Zwingli and John Calvin, who came in and did like even more alternate like alterations to the theology that was developing in contrast to the dogma of the Catholic Church. They expanded on it. And Calvinism was like the main big branch to come out of that second wave of Protestantism. It was really hardcore. there's a lot of diversity within Calvinism. There are a lot of different theological branches to it, a lot of different writers and thinkers who contributed to it. But generally speaking, their main breaks with Orthodox Catholicism was had to do with what was it? The nature of the Eucharist, which is like the communion, the bread and the wine during church. The Catholic position was like the Catholic position is that the bread and the wine are literally physically the actual flesh and blood of Christ, and that is what you're consuming when you take the Eucharist. And the Calvinist position is like, no, it's more metaphorical. It's not literal. It's not actual flesh and blood. Um, and then the second big thing was, have you ever heard the term like faith and good works, like that kind of idea? And
I've heard it many a time. Yeah.
um, so in Catholic doctrine, the way that you get into heaven as a Catholic is that you have to fulfill two things. You have to believe in and worship God. You have to have faith in God, and you also have to do good works on earth before you die. Um, but the Protestants, especially Calvin and his later followers, uh, believed that they believed in the idea of faith alone. So they believe scripturally, it says that you only need faith to get to heaven. You don't actually need to do good works. You usually like their idea is like if you actually believe in God, you will do good works, but the works aren't the point. It's the faith in God that is the point, and that's what gets you into heaven. So yeah, so the Bathories were one of the big Calvinist families in Hungary, and Hungary and Transylvania actually were very big. Um, they were like big centers of Calvinism. They didn't suffer as much repression as they did in other areas of Europe, especially like in France. So that was bad. But in Hungary and Transylvania, they were more able to worship freely because even though they were technically like Habsburg domains, and the Habsburgs were like the arch Catholics, like the staunchest defenders of Catholicism in Europe. All of the major nobilities, families like the Bathories, who converted, did very well to exert their power to protect the right of Transylvanian and Hungarian Calvinists to worship freely. And so even today, the like Eastern Hungary and Western Romania, there's huge populations of Calvinists, even in what is otherwise like a very staunchly Catholic part of the world. Um, and so this is causing like a lot of conflict within, or a lot of tension within like the political landscape of Hungary at the time, because you've got the king of Hungary, who is a Habsburg, the arch Catholics, and you've got bunch of noble families who, on top of being a lot of them being Protestants, are also pushing for more rights for the noble classes, the landowning classes, against the authority of the king. That was kind of happening at the same time. There's this conflict, or like these political conflicts going on at the time. The noble classes were trying to expand their rights and their privileges within the political legal scope of the Hungarian state. And so you can already, despite the fact that the Bathories have like generations of entrenched influence and power. Um, like I mentioned, several Bathories had been voivods of Transylvania, which is like the appointed position, like the appointed minister.
Her family held a lot of political power at the time. They've been in positions of power. They were like the king's almost like right hand man to see day to day stuff.
Yeah, basically. And then there was one more like sort of fold to this whole situation that's going on, and it's that, um, yeah. So there's that. there's this extra fold to the entire situation where Eastern Hungary, where a, Eastern Hungary and especially Transylvania, where a lot of the Bathory's political power and influence comes from, is a disputed territory at this point because
Doesn't doesn't where she grew up and was born wasn't didn't that become a current modern day different country? I can't remember what country it was right off.
I yeah, I think she was born in Slovenia,
Yeah, yes, it was.
which is in like it borders like the northeastern part of Italy today. So it's kind of on the Baltic coast, far west, with Austria's kind of to its north. So it's more in like the western part of the Kingdom of Hungary at the time. But that's where a lot of the Bathory's land is. But they've kind of got land all over the place.
As a child, Elizabeth suffered from epilepsy, which was likely due to her family's interbreeding. Her father also was said to have dealt with this in his childhood. There are no reports of it continuing outside of childhood, which is kind of weird, but who knows what the reason was.
Yeah, I kind of got the feeling that it wasn't just epilepsy that there was because it also mentions like she had mood swings and stuff, right?
Throughout the story that I had read, she very obviously does have mood swings, but it doesn't actually outright say, oh, she had mood swings. Like, it's very obviously she had mood swings. I would not be surprised if she had genetic issues because of the interbreeding.
Right, yeah, and I was because I was kind of thinking when I saw that part was like kind of like it was probably like something deeper than just epilepsy. There's probably like some other deeper psychological problems there, right?
Oh, there was definitely. I think her. Honestly, I think the interbreeding probably. Well, it probably didn't directly lead. Obviously, you can't just blame interbreeding for her actions. It probably did not help her from not committing it. You know,
Yeah, absolutely not.
it was a tick against her. I'll say.
Yeah, it's
So I also did a quick rudimentary Google search. This wasn't in the book, but at the time they would have diagnosed her epilepsy as the falling sickness. They thought was a type of insanity.
yep.
Um, they had some really medieval ideas of how to deal with it.
Oh boy, did they!
Uh, one that I found that was decently backed up was they would take someone who doesn't suffer and rub their blood on the lips of the person who was suffering from a seizure.
Yeah, can you imagine that situation? Just good lord, our girl is having fits. Quick, fetch the peasant boy and open his wrists.
You think that's crazy, but shit like that happened. They did not give a shit about peasants.
Oh, oh man, that's a big linchpin of like my theory for how what was going on with this story.
Let's save your theory to the end.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I'll give you kind of what mine is, but I'll admit mine was tinged based on uh, an incomplete story
Yeah.
or a fabricated story, a fan fiction, basically. So one of the stories that I found that's going to have us follow one of my rules here pretty quickly was when she was a child, she supposedly witnessed. I couldn't find what the person receiving punishment did. It's just someone who was getting uh, tortured, basically, or more more accurately executed. Uh, was that someone was sewn into a horse?
Oh. Oh boy, that's
Yeah. So supposedly, when she was a child, it doesn't specify her age. One of the first things that like kind of this is how messed up she is. She witnessed that and supposedly laughed at it. It's very much most likely apocryphal.
yeah,
That's a shot because I don't believe that actually happened, to be perfectly honest, because she may have witnessed an execution, but there's no way they would have sewn a guy into a horse. Not because I don't think they're cruel enough for that, but because horses were actually a very expensive commodity at the time. They were a very valuable tool. They wouldn't have wasted a horse just for a punishment is my idea.
You want to go and do the shot real quick?
Yeah, kampai.
Rust?
I really just don't believe it. Not be I could see her maybe have seen someone being executed some way, but I just don't believe they would have used the horse in that way unless it was already dead. But the story makes it seem like the horse was alive.
I don't think the horse, if even if it was alive at the start, I don't think it was alive for very long.
Yeah, the horse wouldn't survive, is what I'm getting at. They wouldn't waste a horse like that. Is what my standpoint on it.
Well, I don't know, because like the Hungarians are like they're descended from like a. I think I mentioned this in like our Attila episode, but the Hungarians are actually descended from like nomadic horse people. So horses always had like a very prominent role in their culture and in their traditions and stuff. And that was the kind of stuff that like even the Huns like nomadic people like the Huns and the Mongols like they do stuff like that with horses. Like if they had an old horse that they wanted to get rid of, they find it.
Well, if it was old, I would have thought that the story would at least keep that little bit of nugget of truth if it was an old dying horse, you know. But
Yeah. I don't particularly believe I don't particularly believe the story, um but like there is like a nugget of like cultural spirit to it, I guess, if that makes sense.
yeah, definitely.
And but another thing with that story is like something that's going to come up a lot is the they this was a period of time where it was
Hold up. I've decided to revise rule one. I'm going to have it be anytime you correct me or give more historical context. So we're going to take a sip right now.
okay, works for me. um but like, this was a period of time when and there's a whole bunch of like sociology and political economy and that kind of stuff that goes into this, but basically like it was a time of it was a time of like political centralization. They were coming out of like they're coming out of the Middle Ages. It was going into the I mean, we're like a few decades before like less than half a century before like the 30 years war and the birth of like the modern idea of the nation state. It's it's a time of a whole lot of political centralization from like the feudalism of the Middle Ages, and what comes along with that is a distancing and a separation of everyday life and culture and society between the regular everyday common folk and the ruling class, like the nobility. And so this is a time when you it became really common, like early modernity, a whole bunch of really fascinating, cruel ways to torture and murder people were coming about. And it was especially bad in places like Hungary and the rest of the Balkans, all over Europe, but Central, Western Europe. It's a common thing to see like the nobility is becoming, I guess, what you call like more decadent, and it you can they can get away with mistreating like the peasantry and the common people.
They didn't view them as equal peoples at the time. It very much they the only peoples who life had worth were noblemen at the time.
And there's another aspect to this that at this place during this time, there has been since like the mid 1300s, there's been this huge conflict, all this on and off conflict going on between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Because the Ottomans are in the process of trying to like push up and capture the Balkans and even push forward through Central Europe into through Hungary and even into Austria. And because of like this constant push and pull between the two powers in the region, there's just periodic like huge waves of devastation and death and combat and disease, all that kind of stuff. It's going to desensitize like generations and generations of people.
At the age of 13, Elizabeth became engaged to Count Finric Nadasti. I keep
It's pronounced Ferenc Nadasdy.
Ferink. Okay. I was closer than I ever imagined.
Yeah, you're close.
In a politically arranged marriage between the parents, like it, neither one of them super much had a choice in it. To be honest, I don't think they outright were against it because at the time you really couldn't be anyway.
Yeah, it's just what you did. It's
Yeah, you didn't marry for love at the time. You just didn't.
right.
Um, moving on, we get to about a year before her marriage to Frank. There's a very well known claim that she had an affair or she had a child out of wedlock because of it. There was a peasant boy she had fallen in love with, and eventually, once you become pregnant, and you can't hide it after a while, both families were absolutely livid at her for it.
Yeah, I imagine it's extra hard to hide a pregnancy when you're literally 13,
Yeah, yeah.
which makes me wonder like how consensual this sort of this relationship actually was.
I didn't find an age, but I feel like there was a claim. I can't remember if it was in there or not, so don't quote me on this part. But I feel like there was a claim that it was rape. I do not know if uh, that was true or not. It's claimed that she was in love with him too.
Yeah, I
I don't know how much that is just cherry coating history, or if she was raped, or if that was it was called rape because her family didn't approve and therefore it had to be rape.
yeah, I feel like if it was like a credible, it like as a noble woman, if she had claimed that he had raped her, he would have had his head chopped off.
I don't recall him being executed, so I don't feel like.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Like, I feel like we would have heard a lot more consequences coming from what happened to this guy.
Yes, I feel like there would have been. Um,
But still, like 13 years old, there's probably something going on there.
I very much am not okay with the relationship in a modern context. However, this was actually kind of fairly common at the time, so I can't give my 2 cents because I'm not there. As stupid as that is, I still don't think it's okay, but I can't really judge because it's history, you know.
Yeah, I didn't see it mentioned anywhere like how old the boy was either. So
Yeah, so I, I think he was referred to as a boy though, so I feel like he was probably under 16 because weren't you considered a man at 16 around that time?
it depended. It's there's some cultures that like started treating you like a man at like 13, and there's some that like still treated you like a kid at when you were like 21, like in your mid 20s. It really depended on the culture and like your class and things like that.
Okay. Then there was claims that they tried to abort the baby, that they weren't successful. They did not go into any details of what attempts were made. I don't know about your research. I don't know if it was even mentioned a whole lot.
I didn't come across anything. I know that like back in the Middle Ages there were there were like herbal tonics you could take.
Yeah, there's always been herbal remedies for it, whether they were successful or not, or still continue to be up to date. Once it became apparent that they weren't going to be able to abort the child, they allowed Elizabeth to give birth and had her child adopted by a local woman who was trusted by their family, and she was taken to Wallachia.
Wallachia.
I Wallachia. Okay, that shows you how bad I'm pronouncing it at this thing. It's said that her fiance Farik was absolutely pissed about this, and I didn't mention it earlier, but I looked at the birthdays and they were about 5 years and some change apart because she was born in six, 16 I mean 1560 and he was born at 1555.
Yeah, he had just entered military service when they were engaged.
Yeah, so there was about a 5 year age difference. He, like I said, he was pissed. However, he chose to forgive her. How much of that was like because he wanted to, or he was kind of like he didn't really have a choice because again, the marriage wasn't really a choice anyway. they had a lot to lose by canceling the a marriage arrangement on both sides. Both sides were very much invested in seeing this marriage work.
Yeah, they were both filthy rich families, and they both had a lot to gain from uh, marrying into other filthy rich families. And Frank was very aware. He was definitely as he had a little bit of a politician sort of cynicism to his personality, and as from what I saw.
They eventually did marry on May 8th, 1575, when Elizabeth was 15 and Ferenc was 20, respectively. She was actually 14. She was about to turn 15. My apologies. Before we really get into the early years, like I said, the book I read was kind of fanficky. Um, but it's written from the point of view from her court master, who is an actual person. However, probably a lot of the stuff I'm going to get into revolving around him likely wasn't, and his feelings likely wasn't true, or at the very least, have been highly, highly embellished.
Yeah,
Like this story we're about to get into. The Desto family, which was served the Nadasti family for generations. So this came in from Nadasti's side, so Ferenc's side. Benedict, who it's all told from, his father, Nicholas, had served as the court master, was the person who led to their relationship to be the way they were because of the way he was. At least from the point of view of the story. Again, this is very. Do you want to count this as precip or once we get done? I mean, shot or once we get done, a shot going over the story. Since you're our alcohol master of the night, because this is basically at this point a lot of this that I'm about to get into is doubt. Like obviously,
yeah. Let's establish here for now. Um, People getting tortured in this story are all going to be doubtful, so we might as well count the ones we say are doubtful up front as we'll just go ahead and count all of them as the three sips, whether they're doubtful or not.
okay, and then okay, we'll only put stuff that we say everything from here on is probably going to be a little bit doubtful, but anything that we think is even more doubtful, even for the story, will be our shots. How about that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If there's something I can bring up to establish like why it probably didn't happen, then we'll take a shot. How's that work?
That works for me. From the point of view of the book, which again was pretty fanficky, um, there was a complicated relationship between Benedict and Elizabeth after her marriage. Like they had met a little bit beforehand, but they didn't really know each other. After a while of the after the marriage, like once they got settled in and he was a part of her court, now that she was married into the family, the book said they started an emotional affair, basically.
Hmm.
But they were both children too. They, I think he was comparable age to Elizabeth, so they were literally children. I can't remember what.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think it outright states his book, but his age in the book. But they were definitely of comparable age. Like just the whole way they put the story. If not, I think he might have been younger with the way he carried himself between the two, or that could just been the difference in their level of nobility because he was considered like I think he was like a lesser noble because anyone who was their court master was like given title and all that, but not necessarily in the same way that the normal nobility got.
Right. Yeah, they probably weren't like it was probably probably wasn't like a landed title. It was probably more of like a
And he ended up with land in the end. He had land.
oh yeah, that's usually how it happens. But usually, like there's a lot of those titles um, start out as like unlanded, and they earn land through service. That's kind of a common thing for uh, subordinates to nobility at the time.
Let's count that as context sip.
Sure, why not?
I figure you'll forget to give the command to sip a little bit because you're not used to being in the role.
I am. Yeah, yeah. You're right.
Also, I could if the account of them having an emotional affair was true, I can understand why, at least from Elizabeth's side, because she was in a political marriage. It was arranged marriage. That she didn't have a choice in it. She's not marrying for love.
Yeah, that's not surprising. Everybody was having an affair. That's just how it worked.
Definitely, like everyone had an affair in this book, even if the details of each affair in the book are probably true. Um, After a while of like basically having this emotional affair, they eventually did confess to each other, and they decided that they were going to get married to each other's soul or spirit. I can't remember exactly which word the book used, but since Finric Ferink married her body, quote unquote, not her spirit slash soul, that Benedict would marry that because he it's what they could do, and they quote unquote loved each other. Again, they were also still fucking kids.
I'm going to assume this part was some of the embellished part of the story.
This was definitely the embellished part, although I think this is her being a romantical and embellished. Um, so, are you wanting to count this as your doubt for the shot, or
Yeah. Oh, I am definitely counting this as down. Like I do not think this happened.
okay? I just was trying to specify the type of doubt.
I do not think that she ever got secretly married to her future court master.
If you would let me finish, I would tell you they didn't.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, go on.
They had arranged to meet up by a river off to the side. Like it was basically their secret little kid meeting ground. Um, the next day, and she even prepared gifts for their quote unquote marriage. Supposedly, she had some pebbles, river stones is what they were called in the book, that she was going to fashion into rings, and she had a book made for him because earlier in the book, I didn't really care much for it, but it gives a little bit of context. They had a conversation about how he was reading a book, the original version of Martin Luther's translation of the Bible, and she had gotten him a copy of that. I can't remember the full details on exactly what was special, but it was like a really nice copy of the Bible. And she had some food that they were going to eat, whatever, and they were going to meet down by the river. Well, later that night, after they left their secret rendezvous, Benedict's father finds out, and he beats the shit out of Benedict. Like, lays into him. He drags him out into the courtyard, ties him to a tree while still beating him, and then just hangs him there for the rest of the day until the day is over, till their meeting time couldn't have possibly happened. Like Elizabeth just sits there by the river according to the book and waits for him and waits for him, and he never shows up. And um in in the story, I don't know if this is real or not, Benedict blames himself for Elizabeth because he feels like this is the first pebble in his eyes that slowly hardened her heart. And if he had later on grew the courage to explain to her what happened,
Mm.
because after that he was actually in bed for a week. Like he was bedridden, he could not walk. Like he after he recovered, he still had a limp. His father admonished him and said he was never to speak to Elizabeth casually ever again. He's only to respond curtly, yes, your lady, your highness, all that, whatever titles were used for her properly. Not to have a casual talk with her. Like never would be alone. His father even said, "I'm having your brother watch you, and if I hear of anything," he basically said he'd kill him himself. And that is why they didn't actually get quote unquote married. Do you want to take that shot now?
Yeah, let's take that shot.
Kampai.
Prost. It's just it's the story that I think is a little more narrative than
It very much, now that I actually read the forward, like I just assumed like this was her cobbling a bunch of stuff together and like fashioning a narrative around it rather than actually filling in blanks too, you know?
right.
In the book he actually calls that the not meeting up with her and not having the courage to ever mention it, like throughout the book he never tells Elizabeth that that's what happened. He just lets her believe he stood her up. He never tells her what happened. He doesn't give context, nothing. He calls it the proverbial thorn that hardened her heart.
Yeah, that's
That's very much a fanficky line, obviously.
yeah. I've said my piece.
There are a lot of different claims on her. first introduction to sadism slash cruelty. One claim states that she learned sadism from her aunt Clara, who was a known bisexual witch at the time. This was kind of disproven in her other book by Miss Craft, the one that was the true story of Elisabeth Bathory, uh, um, that I did not finish again, but it was already mentioned and how quick what little I did read. From what I read, that her Aunt Clara actually died by the time she was 10. So it's unlikely if that claim is correct.
Yeah, I saw that claim brought up in a little bit of reading that I did too, and it was
It is a very well known claim that her aunt was supposedly one of the people who introduced her to sadism. It's also touching upon Elizabeth's sexuality, claimed to be where she started down the path of bisexuality, um,
yeah,
because her aunt was a known bisexual.
yeah. Women can't just be naturally attracted to other women; they have to be taught how to do so by a witch.
Yeah, of course. I'm of the belief it wasn't just one person that led her to become sadistic. I think it was an accumulation of a bunch of different things. I think it was her uh, inbreeding that made her be able led to an issue. I think it was her royal upbringing, because they didn't really view peasants as real humans at the time, as like worthy of care. I also think it was her husband, Farinq.
I find this stuff with Ferenc in regards to, like, this particular topic. I find this probably the most believable of like the unverifiable stuff.
I I very much believe that Farinq did teach her sadistic things. Whether the claims I'm about to add to it are true, they're plausible slash believable at the very least. Like, he definitely showed her stuff just because of the nature of his work. Frank was a military, not a general, but he was like a military leader. I can't remember exactly his title.
Yeah, he commanded forces. He eventually like later in his life, he eventually became a general, and I think he was also a field marshal. But yeah, he was.
He was high up in the military chain of command, is the boiled down version. So, according to the book, which again is, I'm going to keep on saying this because I don't want anyone to believe that this is actually what happened, or at least it's not a fun interpretation, I guess, of it, is that after a successful raid, Ferenc returned to the castle with his troops where they celebrated victory. It was essentially a big drunken celebration slash orgy, as the book claims.
Yeah,
During the celebration, which correct me if I'm wrong or give me some more historical context, I'm pretty sure that's how a lot of celebration parties went. It was just basically a bunch of drinking, and
absolutely yes.
that's what I was specifically talking about.
I mean, that's even today. Like that's a universal thing with soldiers.
Yeah, and it kind of is. Yeah, it is. During the celebration, one of her servants was accused of stealing honey. Um, and Frank makes a comment. I can't remember the exact wording of. He likes to use something related to the crime as the punishment. In this case, he had Elizabeth paint the girl with honey. Here's another little, like, they painted her whole body, like they stripped her down and like painted her head to toe with honey. And another claim towards Elizabeth's bisexuality is, while she was painting her, she reached down and like suckled some of the honey off of her breast. That's the story. Um, After that, Frank actually found it quite amusing, and he lapped the extra honey off of Elizabeth's face that was there. Um, you find it quite funny, don't you?
Yeah, yeah, I do. Just the amount of detail about these particular stories when uh, everything else is so sterile.
None of the none of her crimes have exact details from what I've seen. Maybe a few little detail, like what we'll get into next after this story. gives some of the first little bits of like, okay, this is like repeated a couple times stories, but there's nothing much beyond that. Like, um, so the actual torture slash punishment came in after they finished coating her in honey. They actually locked her outside, and the castle they were at was actually known to have a lot of wasps and insects. So they locked her outside for hours, and these wasps, insects, and all the bugs and shit started biting her, and that's where this torture came into. Is they like it covered her in welts and sores. Like, it doesn't say what happened to her after that. Uh, so I assume she survived, but
Oh no, that's no, she died. She definitely, the implication with that is that she died because that's literally like an ancient form of execution. There are stories of like ancient Persian emperors who would
more historical context, sip.
sip, but there are like stories of ancient Persian emperors. There's this particular version of it. There's of course there's been a whole bunch of different forms that it took, but it's always the same with like you cover the victim in honey and then you let them be eaten alive by bugs.
I usually I've kind of heard this form of torture, but I always heard it involved like a ant hill or something.
The most popular version was like it involved two boats, so you'd cut holes in the boats for their arms and their legs, and then you'd fill up the bottom half of the boat with first you put the person in, and then you fill it up with like honey and sweet stuff and stuff that would attract bugs, and then you'd glue down the top boat so they were held together. So all the stuff inside was just ruminating, and then you'd push them out onto like a still pond that was oh what's the
Getting stagnant and like kind of like
yeah stagnant pond where that was like filled with bugs and shit, and by the end of the day they'd be or after several days the victim would just be almost eaten alive by bugs. It was so the implication if with this form of torture is that the person dies at the end. Like that's non-negotiable.
there was another time where Farink supposedly taught Elizabeth some more sadistic ways. This is these are the only times that it's outright like a teaching moment. Um, was when Farink had a captured Turk, and he essentially taught her how to like torture him, specifically like choking slash breaking the neck. Um, and he in this book he makes a comment of how she should practice on the young cervix girls or something to the effect. That feels a little like that's doubtful, but at least that exact story, but something similar happening definitely could have happened at the time because there's no he didn't expose her to that, in my opinion.
Can I provide some more context?
Take your sip first.
Frank Nadazdi, he had a nickname,
The Black Knight.
the Black Knight. That was his nickname, and he got that nickname because he was notoriously famous for how much he loved to torture Ottoman prisoners. Like anybody who got captured on the battlefield, he was just itching. Like his skin was like he'd be like an addict, like scratching his skin, waiting for a chance to torture one of these Turkish prisoners after a battle. It was what he was famous for. So 100%, I can if they had, and this is a big if, but if he and Elizabeth had that kind of relationship where like yeah, I'll show you how to you know we got some free time. I'll show you how to torture a Turkmen real quick. Like I could fully 100% see this as like I could believe that this actually happened.
I just with the way that like it was described that he was always in the military, I don't feel like he shielded her from it, at least with what we know about her supposed crimes. Like I kind of lean towards that she did kill people. Did she kill as many as she's claimed to have? I don't really think so. just kind of like a inkling at my kind of idea what happened, even knowing this is pretty fanficky, especially knowing this is pretty fanficky. Any 2 cents before we move on to her suspected first kills?
Oh, I'm sorry. I did have one thing. I'm sorry. I did find in my reading while Frank Nadazdi was a general in the Hungarian armies, specifically during a conflict called the Long War. There's this story that Elizabeth.
Also, take a sip. This is more historical context.
Okay, take a sip. Yep. But there's a. I came across several articles and several different accounts that say that Elizabeth used used Ferencz Castle as a makeshift hospital, both for soldiers wounded in battle or sick on campaign, and for like local like commoners who lived near the castle. They would come and be treated at at her husband's castle, and that's
That feels starkly contrast to everything we know about her, though.
well that's going to play into my theory that comes up later. But I saw several accounts that claimed this.
There are two main stories from the book from James Oliver that is it Oliver? Yeah, it's Oliver. Were considered her first kills, like, or at least her first known slash surviving kills. Like, so the first one involves a servant girl. She ends up pointing out an imperfection with Elizabeth's headdress, and this is also the origin of her obsession with blood, supposedly. Uh, she boxes Elizabeth's ears. So basically, the way it was described is it was both ears. So basically, slapping the side of both sides of the head, basically in the ear section, which you, if you've ever gotten slapped in the side of the head, that pressure, if it hits your ears, can cause major damage to your ear canal, and it like really hurts. It causes like a ringing. Like I've had it happen before, and supposedly she did this so hard that blood came down the servant girl's nose and trickled onto Elizabeth's face. And supposedly that made Elizabeth look youthful and pale. I have in here to ask you, what were beauty standards at the time? Was paleness seen as more beautiful and youthful? What do you know?
Yeah, it was that was actually
Also, sip.
yep. Yeah, up until like the 1920s or 1930s, for basically at least in like Europe, like Western Europe, and anywhere kind of like within the Western Europe sphere of influence, the standard for beauty was pale skin.
I kind of like. I guess I did and didn't know. Like, I've kind of had that idea. Like, paleness was kind of there, but I haven't really had too much context on it. So please do continue.
Yeah, because there's sort of a class thing that goes with it. So paleness was associated with beauty because if somebody was pale, it means they didn't spend a lot of time outside. And so the only kind of people who didn't spend a lot of time outside is people who had servants to do all of their work for them. And so being pale was associated with wealth. And so for millennia, just countless generations, paleness was like there's like these subconscious conclusions that people come to when that kind of influence like what we as a society find as beautiful, and paleness was that kind of thing.
I'm sure there's plenty of subconscious stuff we'll find if we look at our subliminal, unconscious things that we're attracted to.
Yeah, and then like the 1930s, the 1920s, 1930s hit, and there was this industrialism was becoming a big thing. Being working hard was now more so like being a hard worker wasn't like a farm. It was most people weren't working like farming and stuff like that. It was starting to become more like factory jobs, or even a little later like office jobs and stuff like that. So people were spending, even when they were even working class people, were spending a lot more time inside. And so people who were able to, so and now by that point everybody was pale.
It lost its value, lost its uniqueness, I guess you could say.
Right. It lost its value. And then I cannot remember. There was this actress, this movie actress in like early film or like early Hollywood. She was a huge star. And
So we're talking like silent movie era.
no, this was after it was like early sound movies. So still like black and white, but like but there was this one I wish I could remember her name now. I can't remember who it was. You probably recognize her name if I had it, but she went.
The only one that I can think of, which I know isn't right, is Marilyn Monroe.
Marilyn Monroe came later. This was like before Monroe. Yeah.
I know that's not right. I know this is much later, but that's the only one I can know that like defined a beauty standard. Is what I was getting at.
But yeah, basically the story is she went on vacation to like a Caribbean island or something, and she spent too much time outside and ended up getting tanned. And then when she came back, all of the newspapers started losing their minds about her like quote unquote exotic bronzed skin, that kind of thing.
And that's kind of never left because you've seen, especially like suburban basic white girls are obsessed with the bronze tanned look.
Yeah, like tan skin became. You know what's weird though is now pale skin is kind of starting to come back again. Like pale.
If you're talking about overall and beauty standards, I guess I can see your point, but I still personally don't. I don't worry about how tan or how pale someone is. If I click, I click.
Me neither, but like just like it by and large, like I guess more on like the marketing. I don't know if that's the you know what I mean though, like as marketed.
I get what you're trying to say. After seeing like the paleness and like making herself look more beautiful in her opinion, she supposedly had the servant girl taken to her quarters, where assumedly she killed her and drained her blood or something of the like, and used it as basically a beauty product. Is the kind of like idea. The other one is that she caught a servant girl stealing a pear, like the fruit, and she was so angered by this that she stripped her and just started beating her savagely to the point like blood started spattering over her. And again, she noticed the youthfulness, the paleness, all that. Finished the girl off with a pair of scissors, and then again used her blood like a beauty product. That's the story. I don't necessarily believe a lot of the claims on the blood, even so, because one of the major claims is that she liked to bathe in blood,
Uh,
which isn't really possible, at least before it coagulates, because the amount of time you would have taken to fill a bath would have coagulated the blood already.
Plus, if a human being actually bathed in blood, they would catch some sort of weird infection that would have killed them immediately.
Well, I guess if you're like immediately piling up the blood into a bath and you're keeping it indoors, maybe, but like still the coagulation, the amount of time it would take is just not really feasible for to have happened. The book postulated that she had some herbs and like beauty products that probably just gave her a red hue glow in her, like that she added to her bath and such slash like her makeup, which I think is honestly more likely. And there's our like real doubt. That was my doubt thing, that like one of the things I was saying for our shots. So if you have your shot ready, Derek, kampai.
Pros. Yeah, it's the I can't get over the whole like bathing in blood thing. It's just so
That's one of the quote unquote substantiated claims from her story that I just flat out think is part of the propaganda, because I I don't see it realistically happening.
yeah, like
I think it would, the beauty she quote unquote would have gotten from the blood, even if she had like blood beauty things that like where she like supposedly that it got on it whatever on her or whatever, would probably be negated if it coagulated, and it would coagulate before you could fill it with enough to actually bathe. That's not anything before anyone gets on my case. That's nothing scientific or anything other than blood coagulates pretty fast. So don't.
no, yeah, like the logistics of it. Like she'd basically be stepping into like watered down jello trying to take a bath in that stuff. It just wouldn't be a bath. It like it'd be like a ball pit if a ball pit in like a 180-degree oven.
Yeah, yes, I get exactly what you're talking about.
It's like trying to bathe in melted rubber. But the other thing is like even like the most psychopathic, just insane, like sick mind that you could possibly imagine. I can't comprehend like even a sick human mind being able to handle like bathing in human blood, like knowing full well.
I feel like it would give you like fully like it would just give you bad vibes. Like I hate to use that word in this context, but like it I feel like even if you're like a sociopathic murderer or whatever, bathing in blood would just that base human instinct would like mess with you and you wouldn't be able to like do it in my is the only way I can describe it.
Yeah, yeah, I 100% agree with you.
So moving back to the fanficky book, this is kind of hard to pinpoint if it's the actual first kill in the book or not because it jumps around a lot. It 100% is not in chronological order at all. Like just flat out isn't. But also is like it doesn't give a solid timeline. It doesn't tell you where in the timeline it's jumping to. It just says, okay, this event, if you get what I'm saying. It so it kind of puts it after the torture lesson with Frink, and it's basically she just practiced what Frink taught her. She got a servant girl, brought her to her bedchamber, and practiced torturing her slash choking and breaking the neck. Like it was her. And throughout the book, which this is probably an added fanfickiness, but I'm going to add to it. Elizabeth makes Benedict watch a lot of this stuff. Like he's guarding the room, but also like right there witnessing it firsthand. Like it's very much. I kind of wanted to like go back and forth with you on this when I thought it was real, and we still should just to kind of like there was a lot of loyalty to your nobles that really makes you question the human position, in my opinion. So like the people who are like they've witnessed nobles commit atrocious acts and they just stand there because they feel like they have no power or you get what I'm
Yeah,
kind of explains why a lot of people want to shit on the soldiers in the Nazi army, not the foot ranks who were going along with what the this is my first like thought with it that we're going along with the propaganda, not the people who truly believe, but the people who are like I'm living here, I really don't have a choice kind of people. It kind of it makes you at least understand them a little bit, maybe not sympathize or even like forgive, but you kind of like it gives you a little bit more understanding. Like a lot of people feel like they're stuck in their circumstances in situations like this. Like they no matter what they do, they're not going to make a difference. I guess is the idea. Bystander syndrome.
yeah, it's yeah, I think it's a little different from bystander syndrome because there is the added like aspect to it that like the thing that you're witnessing is being perpetrated by somebody who has like a certain amount of institutional power, and like institutional power is something that you become so accustomed to that it kind of becomes second nature to comprehend it and to react to it. You don't even notice it a lot of the time. Like to a lot of people back in this period, it would have been second nature to just, well, yeah, they are nobility. They have a noble title. Of course, you bow you ref, you refer to them. You don't question it. Yeah, yeah, and it's that.
You don't question it. And like that's I know it's not exactly the same with the people who just went along to get along with the Nazis, but it kind of gives me more context and like understand how someone could be in that situation, even though I still vehemently think they're horrible people for doing it. And again, I'm specifically talking about the like foot soldiers within the Nazis, not like their leaders or the people who actually like led actions or whatever. Those people are 100% pieces of shit and should die and go to the pits of hell. But I'm talking about like
Yeah, the people you're talking about, there's actually an academic term in like World War II studies. There's an actual term to describe like who you're talking about.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it came from a
Sip.
SIP. I forgot what the phrase is in German, but the it translates to English as the little men.
Okay.
Yeah, they're called the little men. They're just the regular everyday average Joe who are typically generally apolitical, don't really care as long as they get their paycheck and will kind of go along with anything without thinking too hard about it as long as they don't have to be confronted with the consequences.
They don't really believe, but they're not really going to question their orders.
Right. And that's and it's understood like the complicity of the little man is what makes the crimes of these institutional powers possible. And to try and like extend it out from just like World War II studies and studies of like Nazi Germany, like to relate it back to what we're talking about now, it's it's a certain attitude. It's you know the meme like I just want to grill for God's sake.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. Like it's those kind. It's the kind of people like I don't care about left wing or right wing. I just want to grill for God's sake. It's those kinds of people that allow these sorts of institutional crimes to perpetrate and to happen without consequence. And it's
This I'm about to like make a wildly speculative thing and go ahead to proverbially smack me. I would like to think that with the advent of modern day internet and stuff, that slowly people like that are going to dwindle. I don't think that we're not going to see more division though. I think we're starting to see people just pick sides more, not rather just going along. I think people are just going to get more opinionated as we're kind of already seeing.
I agree with that to a certain extent. The it's becoming just because of the proliferation of media that's so readily available that it can't be you can't really escape like dialogue about this kind of stuff anymore.
No, you can't. Back on track. We're moving on to the conception of her children. And I'm just going to say there's going to be a lot out here. So get a shot ready if you don't already, because I'm about to.
Okay. Sounds good.
This leans heavily into um, Miss Craft's theory. Uh, she doesn't outright come and say it in the book, but basically her theory is that Frink was homosexual, which I kind of relate back to our Alexander the Great thing. They were traveling warriors. Obviously, there's a huge gap in time, but they were around a lot of guys, accessible to have sex with guys. Um, in fact, going back a little bit, she even had this up and brings this up even earlier. I just kind of glossed over it, but this is one of the things that bonded and reason why the emotional affair between Benedict and Elizabeth kind of, when I was reading it, felt like it had some merit, is because she she has Elizabeth say that Frink wouldn't have sex with her normally. He would only do anal. This is me putting it crassly and like taking it outside the narrative and just stripping it to bare bones. She doesn't obviously she doesn't say this so crassly. She actually says that he would only do it like have sex with me like a man, i.e.
No, yeah, I get it.
But I like I said, I when I was reading it before I knew it was fanficky, it made total sense because she set it up ahead of time. Um, but and with how long it takes them to conceive a child, I'm thinking at least there was something there, be it some intermittent infertility or Frink was homosexual. But according the fanficky version of events, which is probably going to have doubt is yes, Ferenc was homosexual. So come to, he couldn't finish the proper ways in order to conceive a child. And they were facing pressure to conceive a child from both sides of the family. Like they it had been 10 years into their marriage. Like Elizabeth is 25 now, Ferenc is about 30. They should have had an heir by now. Like both sides of the family are clamoring for an heir to pop up.
Can you remind me when was their first child born?
I did not look at the date, but it's 10 years into their marriage is what it was brought up. I am pulling up Wikipedia. I know, great scholarly resource, but
Because I know they had like 8 kids together.
I only remember five being mentioned. Okay, so the first child mentioned is in 1585. So that 10 years after their marriage. She had a daughter, Anna Nadasti, who would eventually get married to Nicola VI Zerzinski, who will come into play later. There are other known children, Orska Nadasti, 1590 to unknown, who would later become the wife of Istvan II Benyo. Again, do not quote me on the pronunciations on this. Please find it charming. Katalin Kata or Katrina Nadasti, 1594 to unknown. Andreas Nadasti, who actually died young. Uh, he was born 1596 to 1606 is when he died. So he died at like 7. And then Paul Nadasti, who, to give a little bit more context on this book, is actually the plot device, basically. So the theming of the book is Benedict recalling his time with Elizabeth as recounting it to Paul as to find the truth about his mother, because he starts out of the opinion that these claims were fabricated, like, or at the very least extremely exaggerated. Like I kind of, subtext between the lines of this fanficky book is he may have believed some of the claims that she may have beat her, like, because beating your servants was a thing back then. Like it was not uncommon for that kind of stuff to happen. Um, but he didn't necessarily believe the major claims of her being like a serial killer, basically. And he was seeking Benedict out to kind of suss like the truth, trying to like clear his mother's name, is what it says. This is after she's died, but that's kind of like that's the impetus for the book. Is Paul is going to Benedict to like find out more about his mother. Is the long and short of it. And Paul was, I think, the youngest. If I closed that too early, but Paul was 1598 to 1650. So he lived to be 52 years old. But yeah, it looks like he was the youngest, but the only male heir. So that lived. That lived.
Well, he wouldn't. Would he have? I don't think he would have inherited anything because after.
Um, he still had a title in the book. Obviously, I don't know in like real life. I think he was still called Count.
Yeah, he probably would have still been called Count. But like, if I remember correctly, like after after she was tried, all of her land was seized and broken up and given to her extended family. So there wasn't anything left for her kids to inherit.
So the start of the book is set in 1620. He's still considered wealthy, and he shows up to Benedict's house, and he's 22 years old at the time, and he still has the name Count. So it, he may have not been as rich as he should have been had Elizabeth not done her crimes or been accused of the crimes she was, depending on how you want to look at it. But that was the impetus. In order to conceive their first child, Anna, um, they sat down one night and there was like a big argument. Like they were fighting back and forth because supposedly he tried to perform but couldn't. Like Benedict was at the door, of course he was, because he's the Imptimus of the story. But it's again, it's basically a fanfic. Uh, um, and he basically says, not he, but Elizabeth basically says, um, just go get your favorite stable boy, and basically she says to fuck him until he's about to come and then come inside her. That's crassing it out. Obviously, it's put more eloquent in the book, but
Oh, I'm sure it is.
that's the long and short of it. And this is the only conception that's brought up later in the uh, in the book. That it's not the first time that sex is mentioned. It's not the only time sex is mentioned in the book, but this is the only time that like conception is talked about. Um, and that's a big dose of like probably doubt. So that's why I had you get your shot ready. But do you want to call that a doubt shot or just the doubt that we cast on everything?
I'm not going to do this based on rules. I'm just going to do this based on like how much I've already had to drink. Let's go ahead and do a sip.
Okay. My next section, I don't have a whole lot on her, is Anna Darvola. She was a Croatian woman. She's seen kind of as a witch, and she worked for the Nadasti family on and off. She was Ferenc, sorry, nanny for a little bit.
Yeah, this is one of the primary like
This is her. This is she's considered like one of the biggest co-conspirators. Like the she's considered the most guilty right after Elizabeth.
yeah, she was one of the four. She was one of the two servants who was burned at the stake.
She has four major co-conspirators or like accomplices supposedly with her. I'll get to them a little bit later, but um, I didn't really find a whole lot on the specifics of how she encouraged um, Elizabeth, other than like she was sadistic. She encouraged Elizabeth. She's also, I didn't mention this earlier, but she's another one of those many people that's claimed to have taught Elizabeth her sadistic ways. It's not really stated whether she was like, it's kind of stated that she could have been one of the first people out of what, like three or four people who could have been the people who led to it slash originally taught her sadism. But there's really no way to know, kind of. And I, other than just saying, oh, she was guilty, a quick Google search on her didn't really put up much.
I'm just now realizing, like who was it who taught her how to torture? Was it her witch aunt? Was it her witch aunt? Was it her witch servant, or was it her CIA agent husband?
Basically. But like moving on to the death of her husband. So Frink died in January of 1604 due to a mysterious illness, but the book says that he was like really for like 2 years he was like dealing with an illness that like had gotten worse over the years. It I can't tell if it's supposed to be two separate illnesses that killed him, one that made him weaker and then one that like killed him, or if it was the illness that slowly made him weaker and eventually killed him. Like the way it's talked about, it feels like it's two different ones, but who knows? I guess.
Yeah, it's the way that as I understand it, it was some sort of disease that affected like the like there was a couple years where like his legs would like randomly go numb.
Yeah, it affected his extremities, and when he died, he was at war, but it doesn't say he fell in battle, but he died on the battlefield.
Yeah, the way it was described was that he was on the battlefield, but he wasn't killed by an enemy soldier. He was just like in the middle of the battle. He just keeled over and died.
Yeah, that's kind of the same way I've got about him. But the death of Farinq kind of like essentially sent her over the edge. And I don't know that it was due to it almost feels like the opposite of what I've been leaning towards the whole podcast. That there's a couple different theories I have on why this could happen, and I have no idea which one I kind of lean towards more. It could be that him dying led to her to lose her mind because, oh, that's my husband, blah blah blah, whatever, or or the complete opposite of kind of like I've been leading towards the whole podcast is maybe Farouk was holding her, like keeping her in check this whole time, even though he wasn't there. But like the idea of him being there kept her from like going as insane as she did in the later days after his death. Because by all accounts, after his death, her torturing got more sadistic. She got sloppy. She didn't care about cleanup anymore. She got more arrogant. She like um it's almost like insanity squared. Like she went further insane if you believe that she was doing all this already. Because this is deep. This is towards the end of her murdering career. Like this is she's what in her 40s at this time. Like this is closer to the end.
The way that I, or what I understood from like what I read was that like her career like really picked up, and she did the bulk of it like after he died, and it was within like a very short time period that she did all of the stuff she's that she was accused of doing. That it was all within like just like a few years, like within a decade after his death, and that it was his death that kind of like was kind of like the
I think it picked up, and the specific stories like of her torturing people, but I don't think that's because I think that's only because towards the end of her murdering career she started picking poor choices. Because after the death of her husband, she after a little bit, obviously she was still torturing, murdering during this time, but we don't have any specific really instances after that, at least none that I could really tell were there. Because again, this was not in chronological order and you couldn't really tell what became before what in this book. She opened a gynoecium. I have no idea on how to pronounce this, but it was from what I've seen, it's basically a finishing school.
I think it's a gymnasium.
It it felt like a finishing school for royals, no, nobles, not royals, but nobles.
Yeah, it was.
This was like when I was mentioning the rumors of her deeds, but it was only the peasants. This is kind of when the rumors were about when she opened her finishing school. I'm going to call it that because I don't want to butcher a word I don't know how to pronounce.
It's Greek. Who cares about the Greeks?
I just feel I don't like trying to pronounce words I don't know how to pronounce because I feel it's disrespectful. It, I do it with names. I always ask on a name, and I try my best and apologize if I screw it up. But
You know what? Full disrespect for the Central Mediterraneans. No respect for Italians. No respect for Sicilians. No respect for Greeks. No respect for the Lebanese. All of them can go to hell. Mispronounce all of their words that you possibly can.
after she opens her finishing school, where she was really starting to get noticed, this is where she kind of like fell apart. This is where like more people started noticing. There is a again now knowing it's a fanficky. I don't think this letter actually existed, but there's the supposed letter that Benedict had that Elizabeth wrote to one of her maids. I have the only guess I would have is maybe she wrote this to another one of her sexual maids because this is a sexual story. Maybe one of her lovers she had taken from her staff, and basically the sharing one of her sexual exploits is the only way I can describe this as is. And he specified in the book, and again it's fanficky, that the first page is missing, but um, one of her servants, Kata, which is probably Catalina, I think is her full name, is also considered one of the co-conspirators, one of her accomplices. I think she's the only one who did not get executed, from what I understand. Um, she has Kata bring her one of the lesser nobles from Poland who was serving under Elizabeth named Anna. And this is after, I think this is towards her husband's late life, if I'm remembering correctly. I think she opened it before. I'm gonna have to go back and re-correct myself or whatever. But like this isn't like that intermediary position or something like that. And after her husband had come back, there was like a big celebration or something. Or I could be wrong because like I did not reference the I referenced the book, but I didn't like go back and forth to confirm everything. And now knowing it's fanficky, I don't care that I didn't. She calls Kata to bring Anna to her bedchamber so that they can bathe her. And what essentially goes from there is they bathe her, and it turns into a massage, and it turns into sexual ex- escapades, basically. And during the sexual ex wow, I cannot say that word tonight. Escapades. Um, things get heated, whatever, and they move it to the bedroom. And eventually, as Elizabeth is brought to orgasm in the book, she bites down on Anna's breast, on one of them, right above her heart, is what she says, like hard, and draws blood. Supposedly, this was so hard that it it was continuing to flow blood the whole time, but not enough to like stop the commotion, basically, or like get her to be a less Anna to be a less willing participant, because like through the story, like Anna's a willing participant through the whole thing. Again, though, this is written if it actually happened, and I'm not saying it did. It could be Elizabeth just lying about that part. Basically, she could just be inflating her own ego that Anna loved it all the way up to the end. They're continuing to be heated in the moment and bring Anna to climax. And upon her climax, she has bled out. She dies as she climaxes, basically. And that sounds very, very fanficky.
Yeah, I don't really believe this story. I think this is, of course, this all ties in. Okay, this all ties into my. I do doubt it, so I guess we'll have to take a shot. But this all ties into my. I think this whole period of her life is all like what we know of this period of her life is all fabricated. But um,
I I kind of agree with you on that. I 100% agree with you on that.
yeah. But I guess yeah, go ahead and take a shot.
Kampai.
Prost.
And I kind of like, barely summing it up, the other major incident at her finishing school was she took three of the three noble daughters on the road on a trip. I can't remember to where. None of the servants survived. I think one of them made it back to the castle but died shortly after. Um, and like during this time, basically, like she got very careless. It states in the book, like people had saw the girls being chained up when they were traveling so they wouldn't run away, all kinds of stuff, basically. Eventually, with her finishing school, it leads to an investigation being opened up on her. And from what I understand, you have some more information on this. I'll give the brief overview and let you kind of take over on this. But they opened up an investigation on her that lasted over a year. The Emperor of Hungary, Matthias, is that how you pronounce it at the time?
Matthias.
Matthias, uh, told Thurzo, which was the prime minister at the time.
I think I don't know how to pronounce Hungarian, but I think it's pronounced Torzo.
Thurzo, okay, had Thurzo. Funny note from my notes. Uh, Matthias, the emperor. I also put who held many other titles I can't remember offhand. He had like a bunch of titles.
Yeah, they included shortly after her trial began, he became Holy Roman Emperor. So he was also the Archduke of Austria. He was the Archduke of Austria, and later on became the Holy Roman Emperor.
So the investigation began, and it said within like by October of the year they opened up the investigation. They had like 52, and then 50 some odd. uh, That's not one of the reliable sources I have. It was the quick thing I found in Wikipedia, because like there's not really a whole there's not a lot of concrete stuff I could find right offhand with the time I gave myself. I'm going to be upfront about that. I didn't give myself enough time on this. By October of 1610, they had 52 witness statements, but by 1611 they had over 300. Basically, is what it says. And eventually, I found actually, according to my book, it was the 29th, but the quick Wikipedia thing is the 31st. But sometime in late December of 1612, they raided the castle. And when they came in, they Thurzo found a dead girl. First thing up, no one really greets him. He barges in, finds the dead girl, then finds several servants. The book says all servants, but I'm going to guess it was like those four major people, the major co-conspirators is what they're talking about, because it says they arrested those servants. I'm guessing it was the co-conspirators. Oh, so the four people that they arrested were Detroya Semetias, Ileona Jo, Katrina Benedicta, and Unos Rivera, or known as Frico. I have no idea how close I got on those names. Probably not even close. But those were the four people that were majorly arrested right there offhand.
Yeah, that sounds vaguely Hungarian to me. So you're doing great, bud.
I have no idea on the Hungarian language. I actually was relying on my little Spanish. The little Spanish I have.
Oh yeah, me neither.
But they found a dead girl, like I said, when they raided the castle, and then they found the servants that they arrested that I just listed, beating a girl almost to death. They stopped the beating, arrested the people, and then they storm up to Elizabeth. So this is like the way I picture this in my head, and the way it's kind of described is they get to one room, dead girl. Get to another room, the servants. Then even further in, they find Elizabeth. They don't mention anyone else in the room. I doubt she was alone, but Elizabeth wasn't doing anything at the time. Like she was completely removed from the beating. Uh, I'm assuming she ordered it. Probably it doesn't say any way, in fact, that she did. But if we're going with the theory that she actually committed these crimes, she most likely ordered it. And that's kind of like the way I've been describing it, is like going from the point of view that Elizabeth did do the crimes. Again, I honestly don't know how much I believe. I kind of feel like she did kill people, but I don't know by how much of the stories are true or not. It's kind of where I'm at a little bit. Um, they arrested her. She was kind of like incredulous that they arrested her. She was, she was like, she felt she was like above the law at the time. Like she did not think she was gonna like. Uh, there, I didn't really get a whole lot of information on the trial other than it happened fast, and she was sentenced to basically life imprisonment. But it's not like a normal prison. She like basically had her own little area that she was confined to, like a a castle. And there's arguments on whether she was confined to a singular room or if she had like two rooms or whatever. And
This part of her story is what I focus is what I the most information that I have on this story. So
then take it away. You're our real researcher.
okay. All right, sounds good.
I'm going to preemptively take a sip because you're giving more historical context and you're correcting me.
Basically, what I've got is that after her husband died, is when her when like all of this the sadistic torture and murder started to like really pick up, specifically in the castle of Shastice, which was her husband, like the Nadazdi castle that he had before. They had several castles, but most of the crimes that um, most of what she's accused of, like after her husband's death, is when most of the rumors of her like her tortures, like it started off as just rumors of like, oh, she's really treating the like peasantry of her land holdings really poorly. Like she's just inviting young women over to her castle to be tortured and killed, like very sadistically. Like those rumors started to appear throughout Hungary and Austria. Um, so the way that I understand is that the majority of the crimes that she's accused of happened between her husband's death, the death of Frank Nadasdy in 1604 and 1610. So that 6 year period.
I very much agree because from everything I've seen, things accelerated at that time. Like very much she went off the deep end is basically what everything I saw said. It very much is after her husband died, she loses her shit.
Yeah, if she was actually doing this, this was the period when the majority of it happened, which makes sense because a woman, even a noble woman at this time, with a large amount of autonomy and uh, like self will, that
I meant to mention this earlier, but like most noblewomen, Elizabeth was educated. But one of the books I started reading, I think it was the true story of the one that actually told her narrative, not the translation of her letters. She was highly educated, even for a lady at her time. Like she knew a lot of languages, even for a lady of her time, from what I understand.
yeah, she knew Hungarian, German, Greek, Latin. Yeah, she had a very unique. She, even for noble women of the time, she had a very unique position in her society. Might have contributed to this, to it, like a sense of loneliness, which contributed to some sort of like psychological problems she might have had, which might have contributed to some actual crimes.
It could lead to an entitlement. It could have led to a billion different things that could have contributed to her crimes.
Yeah, there's a billion aspects to her life that nobody, the two of us or anybody listening to this podcast could possibly even comprehend, so any of the nuances that might have contributed to her psychological development, so that we can't even begin to speculate on. But um but what we do know is that over the years between 1604 and 1610, rumors were abound throughout Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire, like basically Germany, um, about like rumors about Bathory torturing young women in her castle. And these lurid rumors, at the time, they didn't have any real consequences because, like, well, she's torturing commoners, which is like, it's gauche. It's not like very ladylike, but it's not a crime or anything because they're just commoners. Who cares?
Very much, they did not have very much stock in the lives of commoners. It was not seen as a loss. It wasn't seen as they were seen as. I don't know if I want to go as far as to seen as subhuman. However, they were much. There was very much a class divide of worth.
Right? Yeah, yeah. It's I think it's equivalent to being seen as subhuman, but it's kind of different from that because like they were seen as
I don't think they outright saw them as subhuman. However, I don't think there was any functional difference from them seeing them as subhuman.
right. Yeah, it's a whole classification of its own. Um it's it's like, yeah, they're human, and it's in an abstract way it's morally wrong to treat them like this, but in real practice, like, we're nobility, they're commoners, we can do it. The law of order and civilization dictates that, like, we abstractly have a right to do this, and seeing it put into practice might make us uncomfortable, but it's like, theoretically, like, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, so these rumors, they were bouncing around Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire. And then around 1610, the rumors started to come out that she wasn't just torturing and killing commoner women. She was actually torturing the daughters of nobility, like lower gentry that were that were sending their daughters to study at her gynoecium, and then were just Elisabeth Bathory. She had this gynoecium, and a lot of like local Hungarian nobility. They were sending their young like teenage daughters to go and study at her gynoecium to learn how to be proper noble ladies and that kind of thing. And so these rumors were coming out that she was torturing and killing these young women, and they were spreading around basically the Habsburg sphere of influence. And so, in response to these rumors, Matthias II von Habsburg, who would, again, like I said, I think it was 1613, just a few years after this, would become the Holy Roman Emperor. He ordered an investigation into this. The investigation was actually led by Georgi Turzo. Yeah, he was actually a close friend of the Nadasti family before all of this happened. Um, he was a close friend of both the Nadasdis and of the Habsburgs. By this point, he was the I think I think by this point he was either by this point or after this he became the Palatine of Hungary, and the Palatine was basically like I think I mentioned this with like the Voivod of Transylvania. It was the same kind of position. It was I think the English version of the name would be like a viceroy. That's the title name. Basically, like the king would uh, appoint a person to administer all of like the basically do all of like the paperwork, all of the day to day stuff of running the country, and that's what this position
Okay,
was, and that
I get
was
what you're getting at.
Georgi Turzo was the Palatine of Hungary. By the next year, 1611, he had collected the testimony of around 300 witnesses. I think you mentioned something like that. It started off as like a low number, and
It
it
grew
slowly grew
significantly.
to a yeah. So by the end of it, he had about 300 witnesses, and they all claimed that Bathory had tortured and killed anywhere between 80 and 600 women in her castle, and that included what she was actually being tried for was the daughters of lower nobility, like the gentry who were in the area immediately around the uh, the castle. And then, like you said, on New Year's Eve, 1612, Bathory and four of the servants who were accused of being accomplices to the crimes, were all arrested. They were tried, and um, the four servants they were all sentenced to death, all but one. Yeah, there were five, but the four of them were sentenced to death. One of them was
I think it was Kata, the one that was in the supposed story with the lesser Poland noble, from what I understand.
yeah. So they brought around 300 witnesses, and they again like depending on who was testifying, between like 80 and 600 young women were tortured and killed in her castle, but there's never a solid number put down. Um, on New Year's Eve, 1612, Bathory and four of her servants, who were accused, they were arrested. Ultimately, Bathory, her lands, including the lands that she had inherited from her husband, were broken up and they were divided amongst her family, like the main branch of her family, who were the rulers of Transylvania at the time. So keep that in mind. That's basically the broad strokes of you did a pretty good job of explaining like the details of like what she was accused of. Um, I'm gonna get into like why I think that like what my theory about this whole situation was.
Do tell. I'm curious to see what as someone who understands history better than I ever will. thinks of this and like kind of feels like was the case.
Yeah. So, a few things to keep in mind. Almost all of the over 300 witnesses, the 300 witness accounts that were called during the trial, almost all of them, like out of, if there were 300, like 299 were like secondhand accounts. They weren't relaying like things that they had seen. They were relaying like rumors that they had heard, like whether, like, imagine like somebody going out to the grocery store and they run into somebody that they know and they talk for a little bit and they hear a rumor. Those rumors are what were being accounted in these eyewitness testimonies. They weren't eyewitness testimonies. They were just rumors that they had heard through the grapevine. That was the vast majority of these eyewitness accounts that were accounted during these trials.
That kind of doesn't surprise me. It seems like everyone had heard about the crimes, and like it was an open secret by the time she got arrested, from what I understand.
Yes, that is exactly correct. It was an open secret, but I'm not convinced that it was.
uh, Under the assumption that she actually did do it and this wasn't a hit piece.
Right. Yeah. 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 So the vast majority of these witness accounts during the trials were secondhand, like relaying of rumors. The only ones with actual first-hand accounts, they only ever reported seeing mutilated bodies. They never reported seeing firsthand the torture or the killings themselves. There is not a single person in this entire process that could say that they saw the tortures happening firsthand. The four servants who ended up being executed, they all testified against Bathory, but all four of them, their accounts were all contradictory to one another. Yeah. And what makes it worse, all of their testimonies were provided under torture. All four of them were tortured to get their testimony out. And here's something that I need to explain because a lot of people don't know this. Torture is not a good way to get accurate information out of somebody.
No, no, no. So this is actually my I'm the criminal justice student. Like I
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is your field.
insert proverbial hand crack here because I can't do it on command. Um, it is very much there is a reason why we don't use enhanced torture techniques anymore. Not because we're soft, not because we think that we're above that or blah blah blah. They just don't fucking work. And not because we don't think we'll get answers, because we'll get the wrong answers. You know what happens when someone's being tortured? They'll say whatever the fuck you want them to say because they're trying to get it to stop. That's all they care about, is getting the pain to stop. It does not matter if they're truthful. It does not. You will basically, what they will do is they will tell you what you want to hear. It doesn't matter what actually happened. You're not getting an honest opinion. You're not getting the truth when you torture someone. Sure, you may get one out of 100 or a million blah blah times the truth out of them. Most of the time you're just getting what you want to hear. You're not getting an honest account of the events. It's another reason why quote unquote truth serums aren't really helpful. They just put someone in a suggestive state, or
Yeah.
this is not the scientific part, but basically it puts them in a situation where they're telling you what you want to hear, is what I understand about truth serums. There's a reason why.
It's basically why all of MK Ultra, despite all of the evil, heinous shit that they committed in the trying to figure this shit out, why MK Ultra was a complete failure.
There was a whole lot of reasons why MK Ultra was a failure. A whole lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Some of that shit they did during MK Ultra was batshit insane.
Yeah, so nearly all of the 300 witnesses that were called during the trials were secondhand, only relaying rumors, which, and again, all of those rumors were all contradictory. The four servants who testified against Bathory, um, all of their accounts were contradictory and were only brought to light under torture, like I said. After being convicted, one of the servants was burned alive. Two of them had their fingers torn off with red hot pliers and then were burned alive. And then the fourth one, because he was a minor, he was just beheaded because that was seen as more merciful because he was a minor. And then Bathory herself, being nobility,
Couldn't be put to death.
yeah, because, well, it was more than that. Because she was nobility, by the laws that were established at the time, she couldn't even be convicted. Nobility couldn't be convicted of anything. So she was tried and she was found guilty of something, but she couldn't be convicted. And so they just arbitrarily gave her life in prison, like life house arrest. Because Elisabeth Bathory, she was nobility, so she legally could not be convicted by the crimes of the Hungarian state or the Holy Roman Empire at the time, which technically Hungary was not part of the Holy Roman. It's complicated. Never mind. But she couldn't be convicted because she was nobility. But so she was just arbitrarily put under house arrest for the rest of her life. She died like just a few years after in 1614.
Yeah, from what I remember, she died relatively shortly into her. Um, Basically, it was home confinement, but I don't think it was her home. She was confined to a spot. I couldn't find a consensus on where it was.
It was, as from what I could tell, it was at the same castle that she allegedly committed all of her crimes. It was Shatisha Castle. Um, so she was convicted in six, or she wasn't convicted. She was never convicted of anything. So my theory about what happened with this whole situation, a lot of it comes from the scholarship of there's two.
I didn't mention it, but I'm sure you will. During the time that Elizabeth was free and before that, and even while um, Ferenc was still alive, they loaned their ruler. I can't remember his name. A shit ton of money, like a lot of money. It actually came out throughout the book. Like the crown just was not paying them back. Like for years, it was a continually brought up, even though it was out of order thing, that the crown just did not want to pay them back. And I bet you that leans heavily into your theory, correct?
Yes, it absolutely does. You were 100% right. Good. Just for that, I'm going to give you commendations for your research. Um, being able to find that, I think you did. You
That well, so that was something I knew going into it, that um before I'd even known that there was I'm a true crime fanatic, Elizabeth Bathory. Um, Most places that do like the big name true crime stories have at least touched on her or brought her up if they haven't covered her. Um, and the one thing that's brought up but never focused on is that own oh she's owed a fuckload of money and she never gets paid back. And that very much, like I'm sure your theory is going into, plays a part in her crimes. And it
that is actually the main part of my theory.
I'm going to go ahead and outright state I think she did kill people. I I don't know if the all the noble deaths that they were really worried about were actually true, though. Is kind of where I'm landing now. I think she probably killed some peasant girls and all that, but I don't necessarily know if one, it was to the extent they claim it was, but also I don't know that I do not believe she killed any of the noble girls, to be fact.
We are 100% on the same page. So I commend you on your research. I think you did good research for this. We are 100% on the same page. The modern scholarship that I'm drawing on is research done by there's two specific scholars that I'm drawing on. One guy named Laszlo Nagy and another one named Irma Shadetsky Kardos. They're both Hungarians. They've both done research into Bathory's story.
So people who are from the area who have like
They have intimate knowledge, yes. Both of them have suggested that Bathory may have been the victim of a larger, like, political conspiracy. For one thing, Elizabeth Bathory, she was something that doesn't get brought up a lot in this story when it's being told about Elizabeth Bathory's crimes. She was more wealthy. She literally possessed more physical wealth than because a lot of this wealth, even by this point in history, a lot of their wealth is predicated on the expectation of like debt repayments, which is a common thing now. Like loans that are owed are often accumulate like counted as part of like a person's personal wealth. The Bathory family like did own like a big part of their wealth was owned in like stuff that they had loaned to like the Austrian state or the Hungarian state. From what I understand, is that the wealth that the Bathory family had, a big portion of it was wrapped up in the debt that was owed to them by the Habsburgs, who were the kings of the Habsburg. Whoever was the patriarch of the Habsburgs was also the king of Hungary. The matriarch or the patriarch of Hungary. That was how it worked. And so a lot of money was owed to the Bathory family by the kingdom of Hungary. And so that was an aspect of it. And so that was of course weighing on King Matthias's mind, the Habsburg king of Hungary. And after her arrest and after the conviction of her servants, that debt that was owed by the Habsburgs to the Bathory family was forgiven. So I bet that's something that doesn't come up a lot in the more of like the true crime perspective of the Bathorys were, of course, and especially Elizabeth Bathory, they were Protestants. Elizabeth and her immediate family happened to be Calvinist. There were a lot of Bathorys who happened to be Lutheran, and Hungary and the larger Holy Roman Empire at large happened to be Catholic, with a lot of diversity within it. So there's a lot of conflict going on with this, even interfamily, and that also plays into like the theory that I'm trying to establish. But Elizabeth Bathory, she herself was raised and was, at least as a ruler, was practicing a Calvinist. And so what she represented and what her immediate family around her represented was she was a extremely radical Protestant opposed to the Catholic Church, a natural born Hungarian who had economic leverage over the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Hungary. So you could kind of see why she would be like a number one target for the Habsburgs, right?
yeah, definitely. There's no doubt that there was a motivation to get rid of her and fabricate her crimes. I do not think all of her crimes are fabricated, but I couldn't give you a percentage of fabricated versus truth.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something I'll get into in just a second. But Bathory definitely, she had a target on her back, and it wasn't just because she posed like a political threat to the Habsburgs themselves. So on one side, she had the Habsburgs who had a target on her forehead. On the other side, she had her own family, like the other Bathories, especially the Transylvanian Bathories. Um, they were not fans of her. She was kind of the black sheep of her family. In large part because of that whole thing that happened when she was 13, when she that rumor that she had been pregnant with a peasant man's child.
I kind of lean towards that actually happening because there's so many sources for it.
Right. But as far as like what I'm trying to understand and analyze, her family definitely did indeed think that she was pregnant out of wedlock at the age of 13 or 14, and that can definitely contributed to her reputation within her own extended family as like a black sheep or like an embarrassment to the family. And on top of that, uh, everybody in her family, her own children included, but especially like her Transylvanian family, stood to inherit a huge, enormous amount of Hungarian land if she were cut out of the picture.
I don't doubt it. Like, it sounds like her family had more to gain by kicking her out of the picture and framing her for this than anyone else. Like,
Yeah, she was unlucky enough to end up in the confluence of the geopolitical equivalent of like I don't know what I lost my train of thought, but like she was at the center of like a huge fucking everybody was gunning for her because everybody had something to gain, if that makes sense.
I think we can round out our thoughts on Bathory by this. There was her charges are definitely over exaggerated. There's no way she did everything she's claimed to have done, even if you want to think she's a vile scum of the earth. Just there was too much to gain by overinflating it for there not to have been overinflation on her crimes. And there's there's no point in, I guess it doesn't matter how we slice the hair. She was still an evil, vile person. Because I think we both agree she killed people. Like, I don't think anyone can really argue of that, even if you want to argue that for the time it wasn't evil.
I actually have some divergent theories on that. I wanted to get into it just a little bit. So during the actual trial itself, Georgie Turzo, the guy who's leading the investigation, he got caught in several lies. At least historical, like looking back on the entire trial.
Things we know are lies today, but maybe weren't known at the time.
Yeah, yeah, he got caught in several lies and exaggerations in his investigation. Famously, he claimed that when he visited the castle unannounced, that he walked in on Bathory in the middle of a torture session. I think you mentioned that.
So every account I came across, which um, a lot of places like to start off with the rating of her castle. So, like, even the book I read kind of like didn't go through the whole rating of the castle, but like kind of like okay, touched on it at the beginning. The ones I didn't finish, and like even like I've to refresh myself, I listened to the parts of podcasts. Like that is one of the things. Like Elizabeth, when they raided the castle, was supposedly sitting off by herself doing ostensibly nothing. She was not involved in anything, but all the accounts do say that there was a beating of a servant going on by other servants.
Okay, yeah. So in my reading, I came across three different accounts, and all three of them come from Georgie Turzo himself. The first account is that he walked in on Bathory while she personally was in the middle of torturing a young woman. The second account was from a letter that he wrote to his own wife that said that he had walked in, and when he walked into the castle he had come across the body of a young woman whose body who had been mutilated, but he didn't personally see the torture himself. And then the third account from him specifically was during the trial when he claimed that he had walked in when he had walked in to apprehend and arrest her, that she had just been eating dinner. She had just been sitting at her table and had just been eating dinner when he walked in. So there's three accounts of the exact same event from the same guy that all made it into her legend.
I don't trust Durzo at all.
I do not trust him a single fucking bit. And that's the problem, is because the majority of the events of her trial come from him because he was the chief prosecutor. Right. His testimony or the testimony of the people that were like, yeah, like brought as witnesses by him. Because again, he was the prosecution. He was also the guy who tortured all of the people who gave eyewitness testimony, the four servants that ended up being executed. So, yeah, again, he got caught in several lies. Um, that was the three stories that he told at three different times. And like I mentioned, all of the eyewitness testimony, all he brought like 300 witnesses, and all of them gave different stories. None of them like collated with each other.
They all contradicted each other. There's no meshing between the stories, is what you're saying, right?
And the majority of the eyewitnesses he called, they weren't even eyewitnesses. They never witnessed a single crime that took place. They were just
I think you mentioned that, but like a lot of the witnesses were secondhand reports, you said, right?
yeah, like the vast majority of the witnesses he called were just recounting rumors that they had heard around town. And that's something else that um
That's why I'm very much a fan, as much as I see issues with our political system, of our hearsay rule. Like, it's very hard to get secondhand accounts admitted into court. There are ways, but it's very much treated with doubt.
and that's the thing with this trial, is that um there just aren't any eyewitness accounts. There are no eyewitness accounts. The only people who claim to have eyewitness accounts were people who were tortured, which, if we rely on like modern legal standards, torture is not a reliable way of gathering eyewitness testimony.
I don't believe any enhanced interrogation techniques. I don't believe it. I do not believe anything truthful comes from it. I think you get confirmation bias. If you torture someone to get an answer, you're just getting what you wanted to hear.
Yeah, torture is a great way to get somebody to admit to a lie. It's not a great way to get somebody to admit to the truth. If you want somebody to lie about something, then you torture them. If you want to get accurate information out of somebody, there's this really interesting story that I heard. Um, it was like during World War II, in Nazi Germany. There's this. I can't. I wish I remembered his name now. I heard a podcast about him. I think it was Behind the Bastards. Robert Evans. He's a really good. It's a really good podcast if you like history and occasionally like true crime, but like from like a historical perspective. Behind the Bastards is a really good one. But there's this one series that he did about this that he was the most successful interrogator that the Nazi Germans had during World War II. And the reason that he was so successful wasn't because he never tortured a single human being. He never, as far as I know, he never harmed or murdered a single human being. What he did during an
Psychological torture is still torture, although I think personally, this isn't without any scientific research, I think it's less likely, not unlikely, but less likely to get confirmation bias. It still can, but I think it's less likely.
Yeah. Here's the thing: he didn't psychologically torture people either. He what he did was whenever he had like he'd have British or American or Soviet POWs in his under his control. Basically, what he would do is he put them in an interrogation room. He'd come in and he'd just have a conversation with them. He wouldn't torture them or interrogate them or anything. He'd just start talking to them like they were an old friend. And they'd keep talking and talking, and he'd offer like candy and he'd sweets and like stuff that they wouldn't get while they were under like prisoner conditions as a prisoner of war. Like he'd offer them stuff they wouldn't otherwise have. And after a while of this, he once he gained their trust, they'd see him as like a friend. He as like a friendly figure. Like everything else in their life that was going on, obviously they're a prisoner of war during World War II. Their life is fucking shit. But this one guy was offering.
He gave them a brief reprieve from the shitty lives they were living as prisoners of war.
Right, he was acting as their friend in a situation where they had no friends. And as a result, they spilled everything. Absolutely everything. Any secret that they had, American, British, Soviet, anybody that came under his like domain. He spent like a couple weeks with them. He had all of the information, like, and not just information, accurate, real, reasonable information, like actual stuff that the Allies were doing. He was the single most successful interrogator that the Nazis had, and he didn't use a single bit of torture to do it. It is incredible to hear his story because I cannot fathom a man who did such like because he never spent a single moment of his life torturing a human being. Never once in his entire career. He was literally, I'm pretty sure he was an SS officer. He never tortured a single human being. He never killed a single person in his entire life. And he was the most successful interrogator that the Nazis ever had, specifically because he did not torture anybody, but because he made friends with the people he was interrogating. And they spilled everything that they had. That is how you get accurate information as an interrogator. You don't torture people. You only torture people to get them to lie about something. Yeah, and the reason the two of us have gone so much into this is because all of the like real solid eyewitness testimony that was used to um that was brought against Elizabeth Bathory was brought about through torture. And torture, as we've established, is the least reasonable or effective way to get accurate information out of a human being.
Not only is it the least accurate, it's probably the complete opposite. It's almost as with modern understanding at the very least. It it's almost like you don't want to know the truth. You're looking it's confirmation bias torture in my opinion. I don't care what you think from everything I've seen on the research. If you are currently using torture as an interrogation tactic, you're not looking for the truth. You're just trying to get someone to admit to your version of events.
Yes, that is 100% what it is. There is no way to get accurate information out of a person through torture. It's just not happening. No. So, to get back on track, um, another thing that throughout this whole testimony is no accurate throughout all of the eyewitness testimony, quote unquote eyewitness testimony, no accurate body count could ever be established during the trial. It's
That's why there's such a big discrepancy. Again, 300 to 600. I know I honestly do not believe that's 600, but I still thought saw it thrown out there.
Yeah, it's 300 to 600 is like the modern like like oh, what's the word? Like the storyteller's estimate, I guess. I'm not sure about a better word because I'm too drunk right now, but yeah. Um, during the trial itself, the estimate was anywhere between 80 and 600 because every single person that they brought as testimony um, had a different body count. They never established a solid body count. They could never establish. They couldn't even establish one specific. That's not true. Sorry. They had like 3 or 4 people that they claimed were specifically victims of Bathory's actions, but they could never provide physical evidence. They could never provide a solid actual body count for who was actually killed and how many people were killed by Bathory. Because again, this God, the fucking legal system in Europe, before like let's say like 1890, is a fucking nightmare to try and navigate. There's one thing that I noticed. This got brought up like one time in like the readings that I read, the articles that I read. There were it was never demonstrated at any of the records that are available to scholars nowadays that anybody that lived in the area where Elisabeth Bathory was living ever actually reported um like a missing child, a missing young woman. So at the time that Bathory was living in this area, in this region, there was a very healthy like legal practice within the region of Hungary that she was living in. So in that area around Shastisha Castle, there are actually physical documents that we have, like physical um, legal complaints. Like every time somebody would come to the local magistrates and make a legal complaint, no matter how small it is, we have the records for it. People were making complaints for something as small as like stolen or killed livestock, specifically like chickens. From the same year that she was arrested, we have like 60 different reports of people reporting like chickens that were murdered, which were like a which were legally a crime in that area and were reported to the local magistrates, whether or not they were investigated or tried or convicted or anything like that. We have the reports of them.
And we don't see a whole lot on Elizabeth, I'm guessing, if any.
There are zero. There are zero reports against Elizabeth herself, against her, or even for like a. There's no report of a missing person, a missing daughter from any local gentry or any local peasant who had gone to her residence. There's zero. They don't exist. We have 60 from 1610, the year that the investigation started. We have 60 reporting murdered chickens. We have zero reporting any women who have disappeared, who had last been seen at her residence. So you get what I'm trying to get at here.
There's not a whole lot of historical records that would lead us to believe that Elizabeth actually committed these crimes.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, there is zero evidence that she ever committed these crimes. I I don't. I'm sure there's again both of we.
I feel like with the stories that survived of Elizabeth outside of her murders, like outside of the, like, the noble
Mhm.
murders that they cared about. I don't feel like they would have gone to the effort of at least faking the deluge of information we have on the peasant murders for it, that part at least, because they were worried about nobles. I don't think they would have given a shit about the peasants to try that.
Yeah, and I keep that in mind when I get into my theory. It's just got one a little bit more, I promise. So something that isn't mentioned, something that I mentioned before, what I brought up when you were telling her story, is that Bathory was, for some reason, this doesn't come up in like her biography, like her modern biographies, but it comes up in a lot of contemporary sources. Um, she had a large, extensive practice wherever she went of converting whatever castle she lived in into a hospital for local peasants to come to. For some reason, like even your reading, it didn't come up for some reason, but everywhere that I checked, it came up.
To be fair, on your theory, I did not do as good or nearly as scholarly research as you did. I'm going to be factual. It's just I didn't. I to be fair, I wasn't really trying to do as scholarly, to be honest, because I was looking for like a back and forth between us at the time.
Um, but I think that's important to understanding what's kind of at least one possibility to what's kind of going on here. It's well known that locals, it was well known to locals around where she lived at the time that if you had an ailment, you could go to her estate and you could receive treatment. The problem was that often that treatment was, let's just say, it's early modern Europe. It was just after the Middle Ages, it was just after the Renaissance. Early modern medical science was not very developed at this point. And so a lot of,
So I'm going to guess. I'm going to take a stab in the dark about your theory on Elizabeth, that her reports on torturing peasants slash servants were not actual torture, but early medical treatments that were thought to help at the time, and they just didn't help.
yes, that is one possibility. Yeah, that is exactly what I'm getting at. So that's,
I could definitely believe it because you probably wouldn't be able to distinguish from an outsider's perspective. They probably wouldn't know that Elizabeth was trying to help them rather than torture them, because it probably would look like torture them, even if they knew there was a hospital there.
yeah, because like, and she would have had at least a baseline background in like medical the medical practices of the time because her husband was literally a soldier and her household when she was married was right by where a lot of the combat was happening against the Ottoman Empire during the Long War.
And that theory could explain why she has a link to blood, because there could have been stories going around the village that they'd seen her covered in blood from her rudimentary surgeries.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and it's when somebody from,
And you know how the telephone game works. Sorry to interrupt you, but oh, I saw her covered in blood from her surgery. Oh, I saw her covered in blood. The surgery part cuts out. And eventually it takes off a life of its own and its claims of murder.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so like often her treatments, at least what we can like pick up from firsthand, like from the limited records we have, like during the Long War when her husband was leading troops, her treatments were often very experimental and involved a lot of unnecessary surgeries and amputations by modern medical standards. And so these failed but often well meaning medical practices could have been mistaken or intentionally twisted by investigators as victims of torture. But also remember that Bathory also had a reputation for her mood swings, getting back to like her possible psychological disorders. She had a reputation for her mood swings. And and on top of that, she was brought up in a culture which accepted the practice of physically abusing those of lower status. And it's
And let's not just bring into her possible genetic issues. At the time, even if you want to factor out the incestuous inbreeding, nobles were just allowed to be pompous and moody, like, and have mood swings like that. It was expected because they were, quote unquote, at the time, better.
mhm. Yeah, that's exactly it. There's a class aspect to this as well. It's perfectly possible that she was a sadist, but and it is perfectly possible that she did in fact practice torture on young women, but the physical evidence just isn't there. There's
100% Elizabeth definitely um, has some very, very good reasons why she probably did not commit at least the bulk of her crimes, if not all of them.
right. Yeah. The physical evidence just isn't there. There certainly isn't any evidence that she ever killed or tortured any noblewoman. And whether mistreatment she did dish out to women in her area was almost definitely exaggerated in the trial. I think that one of two ideas is the truth. Either Bathory was really just a really shitty doctor, and that shittiness was twisted to justify her arrest, or she was actually a sadist, which is fully a possibility. And she practiced on like commoners, but her practices were exaggerated to include noblemen in order to justify her arrest. And either way, the trial was used by the Habsburg king to cut a political rival out of the picture with the help of her own family, who stood to inherit inherit a bunch of land.
Because you got to factor in, Elizabeth was heir to both sides of the Bathory family, not one, right?
Yeah, she was the confluence of both the junior and senior branches of the Bathory family. And she was the confluence of all of the power of the Bathory family within the kingdom of Hungary itself. There was still like a Bathory voivod or a prince of Transylvania, but at the time, like there was this conflict with the Ottoman Empire that was con- conflicting like who actually owned Transylvania at the time, and so they had significantly weakened power because of the conflict, and so she was the senior Bathory Fowler within Hungary. So it makes perfect sense both for the Bathory family and for the Habsburg family to cut her out of the picture.
Any ending thoughts, Derek?
We shouldn't have nobility.
I thought we had already established that on this podcast.
We established it a long time ago, but I think this episode has certainly solidified like the idea of nobility is
It is very much solidified it, even if you want to, like, even if, even from like a nobility's like biased perspective, it shows the inner workings of, hey, we don't care if you're family. We don't care if you haven't done anything wrong. We will do whatever we can for political power. And that just like that shows the issues with political power, that corruption. It goes down to the stupid old adage, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
yeah. I need to read into that because that quote is actually attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but I seriously doubt he actually said it. But
If he did, I doubt he started it. I guarantee you that. I've never heard it attributed to anyone. I thought it was an unknown attribution because I thought it was such a generic idea that had been around for so long that you could never track the original. It starts off as the story of a mad woman who tortured and killed many people, regardless of their socioeconomic status. And kind of the more you look deeper underneath the layers, it looks more of a noble woman who was framed to take her political power.
Yeah. Yeah. It starts off as a story about an individual who does horrific things, and it ends after some research with an enormous game of power politics that extends far beyond any individual person. And that's why I fucking hate this whole story. I think it's fascinating and I loved reading about it. I'm glad you brought this up as a topic for an episode. But
I, if anyone got to cover Elizabeth, I think I had the right to do it, being the true crime fanatic. Just like if we ever do an H.H. Holmes, I have to cover it. Or if we do any of like the major serial killers that don't have, I feel like out of all the famous ones, Elizabeth had the best back and forth where we could argue for both of us to do it. But I feel like that I can think of right offhand. I'm sure there are others, but because Elizabeth isn't as cut and dry, but the other ones I feel like are more cut and dry. Where oh they they're they did what they said. Like H.H. Holmes definitely was a serial killer. Um, the only
you know what? I'm gonna take that as a challenge. I'm gonna find a way to morally justify Jim Jones.
Derek, shut the fuck up. You're drunk. What are your closing thoughts before we leave for the night?
um go go mess with what's his name von Habsburg on Twitter. He's the last Habsburg heir. I forgot his name, but if you just search Habsburg on Twitter.
Are you telling people to harass the last descendant of a noble family?
Yes, I'm telling you to go harass the last Habsburg. And while we're at it, go ahead and go harass Alessandra Mussolini while you're at it. Um, while I'm thinking about it, what better use for Twitter is there than harassing old nobility and fascists on the internet? It's the perfect use. That's the good proletarian use.
Speaking of the internet, Derek, where can they find you on that useful Bluebird app called Twitter?
You can find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The I is a 1, the O is a 0. Sam, where can they find you and the podcast?
Well, they can find me on Twitter, Tim, aka and they can find the podcast on Twitter called at Alex Society Pod and Facebook and Instagram at the Alexander Society Pod. And if they had enjoyed what they've listened to today, go ahead and give us a rate and review on your streaming platform of choice. And we hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.